Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome to our second keynote session. This sounds strange. Does it sound strange to you? It sounded different the last times I was up here. Well, we'll make do with the strangeness for now. My name is Doris Fuchs. I'm representing one of the three organizations that are organizing this conference, the EU 1.5 degree Lifestyles Project. And in this project, we set out to understand what changes are needed at the household level in terms of the broader structural environment to enable us to even get close to the 1.5 degree climate target. We have several panels and presentations throughout the conference, some coming up directly after this. It's a presentation on our thinking lab methodology that we used by Edina Vadovic. And after that, in the session, there will be a World Cafe looking at where do our results take us, or rather, where do we go on the basis of our results? What needs to happen? And you'll find more information about us. I thought there were slides supposed to be up there. Thank you. You'll find more information about us on our website, as well as at the stall out there. And we put all the resources that we publish, also in terms of guidelines for policymakers, but also information for citizens up there to be widely used and disseminated. So in our project, we pinpointed what are the most important changes that need to happen at the household level, what are the most important structural changes that need to happen. But we also show how extensive these changes are at both levels that are needed, and what challenges we face on the road ahead. Now, we all know, I think we all are aware, that we face these challenges in increasingly difficult political times. And if you want to talk about that, about how to have tough conversations in tough times, please look around for these postcards or get them from Lea or Paula. This is a conference we're hosting in Berlin in December, so please feel invited to that. But now, I have the great honor to introduce to you Manisha Anantharaman from Sciences Po Paris. And Manisha very appropriately describes herself as a multidisciplinary scholar working on the politics of the ecological transition. And what I really like about your work, Manisha, is your broad understanding of politics, which comes from your critical theory perspective, of course, which Manisha combines with participatory approaches and ethnographic approaches. And with this perspective, she can then, focus on the role of power relations and political and economic ideologies, two things also very close to my research heart, but also on the everyday sustainability practices and social cultural identities, and how these all come together and impact how we define and how we organize things like sustainability or environmentalism at different levels. And she also brings to everything, of course, a particular focus on intersectional inequalities. I very much urge you to read her recent book, Recycling Class. And I also want to point out that beyond her relevant and interesting and impactful research, Manisha also is just a wonderful person to work with. She has so much energy, she has so much spirit and creativity. And that doesn't only make her a great person to work with, it also makes her just the right person to talk to us at this after-lunch hour. Manisha, please.
Thank you, Doris. So kind. Appreciate it. Okay. Right. Yeah, so I have been brought here to keep you awake. I will try my best. And if any point you find yourself dozing, feel free to kind of wave and I can take you through some dance moves. This is also a skill I have. So I've been asked to talk about the present, and that feels quite challenging at this moment because the present feels like an unstable time. It's not very clear. But as I kind of lean into this and think about what to share with you, I thought I would start with this reflection that the present, our present, looks different based on where we are looking from, where we are situated in the world. This is the insight that feminist standpoint theorists have insisted upon, that all knowledge is situated. Our experience, our understanding, our analysis is tied to our social location, our position, our positionality. So I thought I should tell you a little bit about who I am and how I situate myself in this present of mainstreaming sustainable consumption. So to confess, I came to studying sustainable consumption actually kind of by accident. I was born in South India at a time when my country, my home country, was going through a range of really dramatic economic transformations that were prompted by neoliberal reforms. So our economy, our financial markets, our commodity markets were opening up to goods and capital from abroad. So for young me, 9-year-old me, this was a heady time of new tastes, new smells, new experiences. Constant, the first time I ate Lay's chips, I remember that. The first time I drank Coca-Cola, I remember that. A particularly life-transformative experience for me was the first time I used conditioner on my hair. I have really thick hair. And when those probably toxic chemicals were in my hair, and I was like, oh, so soft. Oh, this is what development is. Can't wait. And just as all this consumerism was kicking off, you could still see that there was poverty in the city. People were still living in informal settlements, and there were also new problems. So with all these new shampoo bottles, everything, there was more and more plastic waste. This plastic would clog drains, and therefore when it rained, there was stagnant water. Mosquitoes would breed in this water. So as a kid, I had malaria multiple times. My brother had typhoid and dengue. So I decided, what? I'm going to study biotechnology because maybe technology can solve all our problems. It can also make you good money. I can consume more, buy a car, have an apartment, and then I will also figure out how to kill all the mosquitoes of India. Haven't succeeded. So a few years later, I was at UC Berkeley for my PhD on environmental science policy and management, very much a scientist. And I happened to take a class on global environmental politics because it was required. It was a breadth requirement. I didn't want to take it. And I read this book, Shadows of Consumption by Peter Dover. And I kid you not, this book changed my life. Because for the first time, I realized that all these things I had been told to aspire for, a bigger car, a car. I actually don't know how to drive, even now. So as you can see, it really changed my life. An apartment, more stuff. That all of these things were implicated in producing those same local environmental changes and problems I experienced as a child, and global environmental crises like climate change and biodiversity loss. And that, this idea that you should keep consuming more and more was not some sort of given, but rather it was produced by our political and social institutions and embedded in our everyday practices, cultures, and infrastructures. For me, this knowledge was a sort of liberation because it made me feel like I had choices. I didn't simply have to do this. So I decided, well, I want to understand how other people like me, India's and Asia's emerging middle classes, think about and act upon the environment because I was like, well, they're seeing these changes too. So why am I telling you all this, my life story? First, to explain that my interest in consumption comes from this embodied experience of both the joys and harms of consumption at the same time. And I think this contradictory reality is becoming more real all over the world. In Europe, too, you are now beginning to face those harms, those externalities of consumption, particularly tied to a changing climate, bringing heat waves, bringing flooding. And those are smashing into your life worlds. Just as you also know that it's nice to be in a well-heated space. and it's nice to have a closet with a lot of clothes. So that contradictory reality that I experienced, I think, is now becoming it's democratizing. Climate change is bringing this to everybody. But secondly, also, to go back to what this book, the insights of this book and other work, to say that to understand some of the challenges to mainstreaming sustainable consumption, we need to think more about the political economy and what structural barriers the political economy poses for us. Now, of course, I know most of you agree, right? And I think most of the people in this room would say that, yes, we need to go beyond a technological, behavioral, and managerial approach when it comes to mainstreaming sustainable consumption. This is what 30 years of work on social practice theory, economic sociology work, looking at how markets construct consumption, relational work, looking at how sustainable consumption communities are put together and taken apart. We know that consumer choice doesn't quite grasp what's going on here. I think many of us agree that there are no individual solutions to shared problems. Technology has its limits and its place. And as Doris Fuchs and Sylvia Lorek, who are sitting there, dream team, together have insisted time and time again, that we need to think about those systems and those infrastructures that are behind our practices, and that involves thinking about power, political economy. And today, what I want to do is to kind of build on this conversation that we have all been having to talk about two elements of what I think are key aspects that structure and stabilize consumer capitalism in our contemporary world, and that is racial capitalism and coloniality. I will tell you what I mean by these soon, but first let me take you back to my field, just to say that I hope at the end of this talk I can convince you that even if you live in Europe and these are words that you haven't had to think about, that it is useful for you to think about them, because the global dynamics of racial capitalism and coloniality make it very hard to achieve the type of strong, sustainable consumption that Doris and Sylvia have called for. That is sustainable consumption that achieves absolute reductions in resource use while also paying attention to both intergenerational and global justice. So to go back to the story of my research, I told you I was interested in understanding how India's middle classes were responding to local and global environmental problems. So I started my research with a lot of hope, because I felt like, unlike people in Europe and North America, Indians have no choice but to pay attention to the externalities of their consumption, right? The minute you start consuming more plastic, turns out it just ends up on the street, and it's a pain. So it seemed to me that there were no easy technological or infrastructural fixes to these externalities of consumption. And the state, the Indian government, kept trying these very typical techno-optimist, market-oriented playbook, traffic congestion, let's widen roads. But then, just more cars show up, right? The classic rebound effect, Jevons paradox, we know all this really well. The city is getting hotter because they cut down the trees in order to widen the road. People buy air conditioners, find you're cool inside your home, but you're now hot outside. So it felt to me that there was a moment and an opportunity for people to reflect upon their consumption practices and really think about the ways in which their individual choices were also producing these collective effects. And indeed, it seemed like this was happening. So for several years, I studied kind of a range of environmental movements. So people who were deciding to go car-free and ride bicycles, people who were kind of building these community-based zero-waste management programs in their homes and neighborhoods, composting their waste, as well as growing their own food and sharing this in small-scale farmers' markets. And it really seemed like there was, in the city that I was doing a lot of my work, Bangalore, India, Bengaluru, that there was a vibrant community of people who were beginning to see these local environmental impacts and respond to them by trying to make changes in their homes and neighborhoods, and doing this with a lot of effort, a lot of care work, a lot of kind of relational work. And in the process, they were also beginning to think about things like climate change and biodiversity loss. So they were connecting their life world sustainability issues to these more systemic questions. And a lot of these practices bear strong resemblances to the types of things we see in Europe and North America, right? So these are the same kind of practices that many of us have studied in these contexts as well. But as I was observing these communities and practices more closely, more ethnographically, I started to notice some things. So here you have a middle-class person working in India's IT, information technology industry. They're a member of the new middle class. They make a good salary, and they probably have a life and a lifestyle similar to people in Europe. And he is kind of decided to give up his car and ride a cycle because he thinks that's the more eco-friendly option. It's the healthy option. He does this both, on a daily basis, but also sometimes he goes for these cycling trips. And I found that this guy and the people like him, their cycling communities and cycling movements had nothing to do with that other guy. Even though in Indian cities, until recently, about 10 to 14% of the modal share is bicycles, and it's largely that second type of guy, a working class cyclist, usually male, who relies on the bicycle as his main mode of livelihood and transport. So what he's doing is he goes around collecting plastic and metal materials from households. So you can see he has these various things tied to his bicycle, and then he'll give you a recycled plastic bucket for the thing that in exchange for what he collects. And so the middle-class cyclists' movements and communities, their discourses were completely separate from the many more numerous working-class cyclists in the city. And to some extent, that actually weakened their movement, because then when these, the cyclists in the spandex went to the state and say, we want to promote cycling in the city, we want more bike lanes, they actually didn't have that many numbers behind them. It weakened their movement, that they were not in conversation with these more numerous working-class cyclists. Similarly, when I was observing these zero-waste communities, so while people in their homes and their neighborhoods were really working very hard to, change their behaviors of their family members, behind all of that, in the basement, in the back room, there was always someone else. There was a maid, a domestic servant, who was then going through these materials in further detail, further segregating them and transporting them. And again, this lady was never part of the environmental initiative. She was, somebody who was told what to do and was told off when she didn't do it properly, and kind of was always on the edge. She was not seen as an environmentalist. So in a series of publications beginning now about a decade ago, in 2016, I started writing about this. And like a good sociologist, when you see these processes of class distinction, you turn to cultural sociology, the work of Pierre Bourdieu. And I started kind of writing about how these green consumption practitioners in India, who were really doing these practices in a context where owning a car and driving a car was an aspirational activity of class identity, right? Where working with waste was seen as something you shouldn't do if you belong to the middle classes. It's a dirty work associated with a stigmatized caste identity. I'll talk about that in a minute. That in these places, people worked very hard to distinguish their environmental practices with waste and bicycling from the practices of the poor. And they did this using kind of the images, the skills, and the competencies that they developed in order to share their practices. So fundamentally, these processes of distinction were essential to normalizing these eco-friendly practices amongst the middle classes. They normalized them by saying, I'm doing it because I'm green. I'm not doing it because I'm poor. And so in the kind of the most recent publication on this topic, which came out in Consumption and Society, I've argued fundamentally that performative environmentalism is actually something quite harmful to sustainability movements, because this form of environmentalism is something that is made possible by privilege. So in the contemporary and current political economy, the practices most associated with and celebrated as sustainable or enlightened are accessible only to those who either have surplus time or surplus money to go green, which is actually not that many people. Because of this, sustainable consumption becomes exclusive and exclusionary, inaccessible to the many who do not have, in Bourdieu's words, the feel for the game. They don't know how to do it authentically, or the economic resources to buy green. And fundamentally, this means that these practices end up becoming niche subcultures and struggle to mainstream. They struggle to become, something that's accessible and aspirable to those who do not already have the cultural capital or the economic capital to be able to carry out these practices in an authentic and convincing way. And I think these dynamics of distinction within green lifestyle movements have consequences for who participates in the debates around sustainable consumption and sufficiency, who sees themselves as, having a voice or a say in the room. And, as I spent more time kind of thinking about this, right, and especially like when I read quotes like this saying, in our country, if you spot a cyclist, you assume they're cycling because they don't have money, so wear this T-shirt so you can get back your respect. Or, this image which shows this, woman talking about zero-waste practices, but I don't know if you see the workers in the background who are sitting amongst the waste, bent, and you see, again, very clearly these class distinctions playing out in the performance of these forms of environmentalism, in the performance of these forms of sustainability. And I asked this kind of thinking about this over the years prompted another question for me. Why were these middle-class people putting so much effort into demonstrating that they were going green, not because they couldn't afford to consume, but because they cared about the environment? Why were they so concerned about not appearing poor? Since then, I have come to the conclusion that the class politics and anxieties of sustainable consumption or sufficiency are not just about social identity or distinction. They are deeper. They are tied to the colonizing and racializing origins of capitalism and the ways in which those are today expressed in the anti-poor ideologies of neoliberal life. So now I want to talk about colonialism. Sorry. So, contemporary capitalism is fundamentally shaped. Well, you can all have a break now while I pick up my papers. So contemporary capitalism is fundamentally shaped by its colonial and racial origins. And we see this at all stages of what we think of as the production-consumption cycle, right? So all the way from extraction, production, provisioning, consumption, and its afterlives. And I think that this colonial and racial origins and the ways in which those are expressed today play a fundamental role in stabilizing consumer capitalism because they are the main way in which capitalism solves its crises. When there's a problem, you find a colonial frontier to go fix it. And I'll talk you through why I think this and how I think this might be happening. So let's start with the production piece. And I'm guessing many of you are already familiar with the colonial roots of consumer capitalism and kind of the origin story of capitalism, so I will not belabor this point too much. But several post-colonial scholars, Gurminder Bhamra, Immanuel Wallerstein, Jason Moore and Raj Patel, writing from a more kind of ecological Marxist perspective, have demonstrated that imperial histories were not something peripheral to the development of global capitalism, but actually quite central to how capitalism emerged, evolved, and became the dominant political economic system of our time. So colonial regimes eliminated indigenous populations, commodified land and resources, and expropriated wealth to enrich the imperial core. These violent acts of expropriation and extraction left their legacies upon the earth and the people of colonized regions. And so much so that these legacies have not disappeared. The symbolic and material effects of colonialism endure. And in very important work, Jason Hickel and his colleagues have shown how this drain of wealth did not end with independence. Previously colonized regions were often integrated into the global economy in unfavorable terms, and through things like debt repayment regimes, trade rules and deficits, and ecological appropriation, this drain of wealth, this net appropriation of resources and labor continues on. And indeed, since World War II, it continues under what economist Paul Krugman called in a podcast yesterday, the soft, bloodless imperialism of the American-led Bretton Woods era, which of course is the very era that Donald Trump appears to be trying to end in this moment. Happy to talk about that later if you wish. Now, but what's important to remember is that the effects of colonial expansion were not simply economic, they were also cultural and symbolic. And these cultural and symbolic dimensions, I think, are also really important to think about when it comes to the consumption conversation. And one of those cultural and symbolic processes I want to talk about today is racialization. So Black Marxist scholar Cedric Robinson coined the term racial capitalism to describe how capitalism incorporates and depends on the devaluation of non-white bodies as part of its accumulative profit-making strategies. So what does this mean? So Robinson argues that from its very beginning, capitalism tended to take dialectical, linguistic, and ethnic differences and turn these into racial hierarchies. And what is a racial hierarchy? Racial hierarchies associate certain bodies with certain fixed identities, which then creates a regime where different bodies can be exposed to different rules and different conditions, and that is seen as normal and justified. So racialization essentially creates embodied exceptions, where some can have certain rights, get certain wages, while others get very different rights, very different wages, or are even owned as property, in the case of slavery. So thinking historically with racial capitalism and thinking kind of broadly across the world helps us kind of think about how there are common patterns through which the exclusion, exploitation, and disposability of people is accomplished in different parts of the world. So take here, for example, undocumented Mexican migrants who work in the fields of California, and because they were undocumented, continue to work through the time when forest fires were burning and the air quality was so bad that everyone else who could went home and stopped work, but they continued to pick fruit. Think about the second picture here, which is this woman who belongs to the Dalit community in India. So Dalits being members of the oppressed caste, scheduled caste groups who are at the very bottom and the outside of the caste order. And because of this, and caste being this kind of birth-based way of segregating people according to who they are born to, and consequently their bodily selves, it's not something you can get out of. You're fixed. She here is cleaning a toilet just by herself. She's manual scavenging. Even though this is legally outlawed, it is still socially sanctioned. The thing that allows it to be socially sanctioned is caste. It's racialization. The idea that she can do that, she should do that, she's fated to do that. And finally, in the third picture, indigenous Guatemalans and Afro-Brazilians who across Brazil are the ones who go through landfills and pick out recyclable materials. So we see a common pattern here, that is, it's these racialized communities. Again, the processes of racialization and who is racialized might vary from place to place. I would be curious to ask you, who are the racialized communities of Europe? I know they exist. The processes may differ, the mechanisms may differ, but there is a common sense that certain groups, certain people, certain bodies can and do forms of work that are exploited and expropriated. So thinking historically with racial capitalism shows us the shared processes through which certain people become marked as disposable. It becomes a way to justify slavery. It becomes a way to justify cheaper wages. It becomes a way to really justify expropriation of various kinds. Racial capitalism also does something else that is important for the sustainability conversation. It marks non-capitalist lifeways as illegitimate or unproductive. So what this means, for example, is indigenous people across the Americas resisted incorporation into waged work, resisted market-based economies for long periods of time. Sustained settler violence had to be imposed upon them in order to essentially bring them into these economies. And one of the ways in which this was accomplished was through land theft, but also by getting rid of their subsistence economies, such as through the buffalo. Racialization also plays out in the domain of consumption. So as Frank Trentman has shown in his work, global consumer culture was not just something that emerged out of industrial capitalism, it was also tied to imperial histories that brought these exotic goods like cotton, sugar, and milk to the colonies, while also determining who in the colonies could have access to these European luxury goods. So as you can see in this first picture here, in India, the members of kind of native Indians who were able to consume like the British were largely dominant castes. So within that caste system, the groups up top. And at the same time, other materials were kept away from racialized groups so as to, again, reaffirm those hierarchies and to solidify them. Now, when we come to the moment of today, right, and we think about the work of Ulrich Bland and Marcus Wissen, who say that these logics of consumer capitalism, the logics of liberal markets are being unconsciously reproduced through our everyday practices, and it is through that in which the state is able to kind of justify having these relations, these imperial relations, and pursue these policies as something that's necessary and inevitable. Now, the thing is, this is not just something that's happening in Europe. In India, too, the state points to consumption success. It points to the fact that people are consuming more and more to say, oh, but don't worry so much about jobs. Don't worry so much about poverty. These imperial histories are important to keep in mind because these dynamics of racialization have not disappeared. They have just been reconfigured. They have been invisibilized in the contemporary era. And how I want to tell you that I think the way in which they've been invisibilized is around this idea of neoliberal stigma. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about what I mean by neoliberal stigma. So neoliberal stigma, which is a term coined by the communication scholar Rebecca D'Souza, points to the idea that poverty is a product of individual moral failure. So just as you have these societies where consumption and consumers are celebrated, right? Consumption becomes not just a sign of status, but of belonging, of propertied citizenship in a political order. If you do not consume, if you are poor, you do not belong. You are outside. And once the cause of your poverty can be identified as your own failing, your lack of merit, your incompetence, the individualization and the stigmatization of poverty through neoliberal stigma helps hide these historical and structural conditions that produced this stratified and stratifying mechanism of racial capitalism. Instead, it becomes, well, you are not consuming because you were not good enough. You are not productive enough. So neoliberal stigma measures the worth of each person on the basis of their economic productivity and their consuming power. And therefore, those who do not consume are seen as lacking. They are admonished to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they're humiliated when they are not. So neoliberal stigma perpetuates an unsustainable consumption in several ways. First, it drives aspiration, because those who do not belong, not only do they not belong in terms of they don't have status, they are actually outside proprietary citizenship. They are not fully included in the polity. So on the one hand, it drives aspiration, because those who do not belong now seek to belong. And the market offerings of cheap credit, discounts, and low-cost retail enable that type of market stratification for expansion. But it also, as I said, conceals structural inequality, because it replaces this overt stigmatization of these non-market, non-capitalist lifeways with market-based exclusion and exploitation. I'll give you a quick example from Bengaluru to show you how this works. So again, the city Bengaluru, where I do a lot of work, in order to promote consumption, it's been developing a lot of infrastructure for consumption, right? So highways for cars, gated communities, shopping malls. How does it go about acquiring land to do this in this very crowded and dense cities? Well, it goes and says, we will evict people living in informal settlements. We will take over parks. Why these places? Why these people? It says because they are illegal. They are unorganized. they are not doing any sort of valuable work. This is informal work. It doesn't produce any value for the city. Similarly, when it needs to find places to dump its waste, it goes to the peripheries. It goes to the commons, the urban commons, where people graze their cows and says, well, this is wasteland. This is not land that's being used for anything productive. So it is in these registers, by deciding what is valuable and what is valueless, which again are registers that come from the very founding original myths of capitalism, that today the city decides what land use is valuable, whose activities are permitted, and whose activities are not. So the people who live in slums, the people who are grazing, now do not have livelihoods. And where do they seek their livelihoods? They go to the detritus of waste. More and more people in Indian cities are today turning to waste as their source of livelihoods. They pick through these dumps, these materials, pulling out materials that they can resell or they can clothe themselves with. And even though they provide a vital economic and environmental service, in many cases the informal sector provides more materials and resources than the formal waste management sector, they're seen as dirty, as illegal, as criminal. And this is not just something that matters in India, because turns out waste from Europe is also showing up there. It gets exported. It goes to places like India and other parts of Asia in what Max Le Baron calls as an example of pollution as colonialism. And in these places, it is again these waste pickers who go through these dumps, who pull out the materials that have value, and through that, they make sure that landfills are not overflowing. They reduce the amount of methane going into the air. 58% of plastic recycled is by informal waste pickers and waste recyclers. However, I find in my research on the global politics of the circular economy that these waste pickers and the repairers in the informal economy who have really the knowledge and expertise are very much at the periphery of these conversations and do not find themselves having a voice in these debates. And I won't have much time to go into this, but even when there are attempts to partner with these communities, these partnerships end up reproducing those very racial and colonial logics, where waste pickers continue to do the least paid jobs under the most exploitative conditions. And even if a few members of their communities come out of poverty, many more are left behind in those difficult work conditions. So I want to conclude by saying that mainstreaming strong sustainable consumption without addressing colonial capitalism's legacies, I think will have two outcomes. One, it will reproduce inequalities, as we see with the circular economy model, where an attempt to try and do an inclusive circular economy without thinking about these dynamics of racial capitalism actually just ends up reproducing these patterns of racialized labor that exist in the linear economy. Or if we think about kind of green transitions and eco-social transitions in Europe taking place without thinking about the global effects of, for example, a race for minerals. Or they're going to be political non-starters, because if consumption is core to identity and political stability, degrowth and decommodification are going to generate suspicion and resistance by the people who already feel themselves excluded from consumer capitalism. If material poverty and non-capitalist lifeways are stigmatized due to colonial legacies, sufficiency is only accessible to those with existing privilege. But I wanted to end on a hopeful note, because I was told. I do think we are in a moment of change. And to quote Zizek quoting Gramsci, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. It does feel like a time of monsters. But the good news is consumption is mainstream news now. Yo, we won. We mainstreamed consumption. Now we just have to do the sustainability bit. It is at the center of political debates. And another piece of good news, in Indian cities, the poor and informal workers are much more numerous than the rich and the middle classes. Waged work and high consumption is the exception, not the norm. Sweden is a glorious exception in the world. So what does this mean in terms of the political opportunities that it poses if we change where we look from And we look from global south cities, where we see the impacts of eviscerating racial capitalism play out day in and day out. I want to close here by putting up an image that one of my students made in one of my classes when I teach these topics. And for me, it gives me a lot of hope to look at it. Because I think part of mainstreaming sustainable consumption is to think very clearly about the histories that have brought us here, to acknowledge those histories, and to, from a place of kind of unrelenting discomfort, think about how we can move forward, which thankfully is Tim Jackson's job tomorrow. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, I think I didn't promise you too much. So much to make us think about things and question things and go forward, hopefully. Now's the time for your questions. We have 2 microphones ready for you with Matthias and Josefina. So if you put up your hand, somebody will come and bring it to you. Who has the first question? I know, oh, there's one, perfect.
Thank you so much, Manisha. That was a very interesting presentation, and I feel like I learned a lot. I'm wondering a little bit about the individualization of poverty and pulling yourself up by the bootstrings. Do you have any ideas of how to kind of change that or make it possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of research on this. And maybe one thing I should say is, I think there's an opportunity to connect research on sustainable consumption to other fields of research that are talking about things that are relevant. So, for example, there is a very vibrant field of work called relational poverty studies, which is all about paying attention to kind of the public policies and the social mechanisms that produce poverty, right? That produce conditions of poverty and produce the experience of poverty. So whether that is, going to sign up for your dole, to receiving public housing, how are these experiences setting up a particular experience of poverty as a stigmatizing process versus the ways in which they are opening up opportunities, for example, for people to pursue more sustainable ways of living. I know this is what the work that Sherilyn McGregor, Lucy Middlemis, and other people are trying to do in terms of their joined up sustainable transitions work. So my response to that would be to learn from other fields that have been thinking a lot about those topics, right? So relational poverty studies, feminist economics, and really trying to think about bringing in their theorizations of the dynamics of poverty and to think about how the function of poverty in terms of maintaining unsustainable consumption.
There's one up front here.
Thank you so much, Manisha. Yeah, really fantastic presentation. I always feel so inspired after listening to you, so thank you. I'm just wondering, with regards to stigmatized neoliberalism, whether you see any resistance to that amongst groups that are stigmatized or that feel they have to emulate constantly this, high consumption goals.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we have seen kind of really powerful examples of poverty being politicized, right? So communities refusing that stigmatization. So in the US, the Poor People's Party is a classic example of essentially this effort to kind of take that stigmatization and say, no, we're focusing on the political aspects, so we're organizing as people who have been impoverished. I think we're also seeing that today in terms of environmentalism. More and more, in the UK, I think there's this growing movement of kind of working class environmentalism and a very strong working class critique of mainstream environmentalism coming up with people like Chris Shaw and others writing very forcefully about this. So I think this is happening. And perhaps one of the goals is to bring those folks into this room and into the conversation as well. So thank you. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, a nostalgia. Yeah, and I think that's very much implicated in this too, right? The populist right plays on the fact that the economic conditions of people's lives seem to be degrading. They feel increasingly out of control and helpless in the face of that and are looking for someone to blame. So I do think that thinking about that is also part of the story.
Way in the back.
Run, run.
Yeah, thanks, Manisha. Cool as always. I mean, we also have a problem with the way we produce knowledge, the epistemic injustices, and so on. So how can we decolonize our research and also SCORAI, maybe?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak. Because I feel like for me, that was a big deal, you know? I think the fact that we need to understand these dimensions of consumption and the challenges of consumption from diverse places in the world, diverse standpoints, we need to think about, you know, the ways in which our research is political. Whether we like it or not, apparently climate change, a scientific fact, is now too political, right? So one thing I think we can ask ourselves as a community is, what are the ways in which the types of research questions we ask, the methods we mobilize, what do those things leave unsaid? This was actually my first big frustration with sustainable consumption research, which I wrote about in 2018, which I felt that a lot of the research focused on kind of these niche green lifestyle practices carried out by white middle-class people in cities, and completely ignored the conditions of oppression that made all of that possible. And I think by expanding our lens and to take into account these background conditions, the care work within the home, the racialized labor outside of it, we have the opportunity to expand the conversation and also invite more people into it. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. You already said that you might want to talk more about American politics. So I just tried. And I don't want to discuss the stupidity of everything that's going on, but the current trade and tariffs that are being employed. The argumentation is that the world is exploiting the US, which of course is very wrong, and you showed us that the opposite is true. And so now I want to know if that maybe for the wrong reasons, something good is actually happening right now, as the exploitation from Western countries, or let's say from the US, in other parts of the world is decreasing as they want to be more autonomous. So do you see positive effects when it comes to colonialism and maybe setting boundaries for capitalist exploitations in the world?
Yeah, I know. I think that's a really difficult question to answer. But what I will say is, going back to a point I made, all of these processes, colonialism, trade-oriented development, they all leave material legacies, right? So countries, places have been designed now to serve as factories for global economies. That comes at the expense of local ecologies. That comes at the expense of investment in social reproduction. So I think just stepping away is not necessarily in of itself going to help those places and those countries meet their needs. I think it is actually, for me, I think a lot about ideas of reparation. For me, sustainable consumption has always been a world-building project, right? It's about repairing our relations with each other and with the planet. So what is the role also of kind of a reparative dimension to overcome some of these hurts of colonialism? But to answer to your question, is Trump's move going to bring in a glorious decolonial movement? I don't think so.
Okay, there's one in the middle, one here up front.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed how you linked this kind of niche privilege. So my question here is this middle-class white What are the mechanisms to change that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think already there have been some really good examples, right, of people beginning the sustainable consumption investigation with groups who are experiencing economic insecurity and trying to understand from that standpoint, what are the basic needs that people are not able to meet, or people are only able to meet through the market where they cannot afford things. So I think, again, the work that has been done with immigrant households, with elderly people, with people experiencing disabilities. So I think one is changing who we think as the suspects of a sustainable, especially as this agenda has grown. It's grown beyond just trying to get rich people to change, right? Today, it's much more than that. It's an overarching agenda of a different way of organizing our political economic systems. That's what we're working towards. Changing the vantage point of where we do our research from, going back to that epistemic knowledge question, also learning from those experiences, understanding what it looks like from there. The methods, again, the assumptions we use in our work, also, I think, come into play in terms of helping shift that. Now, at the same time, I do think we need to study rich people. Clearly, they consume a lot and they have a lot of power. But I think it's also how we study them and what we say about them that matters.
Hi, Manisha. My name's Kat, and I think we've been in contact over email, but never actually met in person. So thank you so much for that presentation. So inspiring, like all of your work. And my question builds on what a number of other people have already asked, but just in light of the way that racial capitalism and colonialism underpin all of this, like I've been thinking increasingly about where is the best place to put your energy in terms of taking action. And if we are interested in sustainable consumption, I'm wondering if that needs to start with different forms of collective action and building solidarities and trying to divest from these systems and overturn them. So I was just wondering if you have any kind of examples or experiences of forms of collective action you've seen that maybe mobilize these solidarities that you find particularly hopeful and maybe you could share?
Absolutely. So I think something I write about in my book is the coalition politics between waste pickers and other actors who are trying to push for a plastics treaty that doesn't simply just, focus on recycling and help continue the generation and production of plastics, right? So waste pickers have a very particular analysis and analytic of what is wrong with our consumption systems. Everybody says, well, if we do circular economy, they won't have livelihoods anymore. They're like, no, most of the stuff you throw away is actual crap. It's not something that has value. So from their perspective, they are able to call the bullshit of big oil, of large corporations. And they have brought their knowledge practices, their organizing practices, through trade unions, through other sorts of organizing mechanisms. They've organized internationally amongst each other, and now they're building partnerships with zero waste organizations, break free from plastics. And together, they are a strong bloc in the Global Plastics Treaty, so much so that they prevented, to some extent, a plastic treaty from being written, right? Which would have been a very weak one. And the process is now continuing, which in some cases, we could think of that as a loss, but we can also think of it as a win. So for me, the work I have kind of seen waste pickers do, also build coalitions with other sorts of environmental actors and really use the environment as a leverage to kind of bring their perspective, their knowledge on socio-ecological systems to bear has been something that has given me a lot of inspiration in my work. And we write about it in an interview for Consumption and Society that Mary organized with Sonia Diaz, who works for the Women in Informal Employment Globalizing and Organizing, which is a big international network really organizing informal workers.
Okay, more hands, more questions. Do you see some? Last question, I'm being told.
You have to run now again. It's all the way in the back.
Thank you so much, Manisha. It was very inspiring. And going back on what you said about how to tackle distinction and the problem with, let's say, high socioeconomic status people, what would you do with it overall? Like, how do you envision building down distinction because it hasn't fully, well, hit the mainstream among those circles yet, even with distinctions. So I'm just wondering what to do with that.
No, I think you ask a very, very good question. And I don't know if there's a way actually to get over the the dynamics of distinction, which seem to be pretty fundamental to being human. And there's a lot of sociological evidence for that. But I think the aspect of it that is important is for us to pay attention to the ways in which that works into our normative frameworks, right? So if we talk about sufficiency and the need for sufficiency, we have to pay attention to how those dynamics of distinction undercut our ability to design social systems around sufficiency. Now, at the same time, we know the patterns of distinction are very different from country to country. Today, I presented a very kind of global outlook, right? But we know that the reason why distinction and market has become so important in the US is because the social state has been eviscerated in the past 40 years. I actually think people don't have much to measure the quality of their lives around beyond the things that they acquire in the market, because they do not have social protections. They don't have time off when they have children. They aren't able to take time off when they're sick. So it is also those other aspects, the decommodified and non-commodified ways in which people's lives can be supported, that I think also help mediate and dampen the overall political force that distinction takes on in any given socio-political system.
Thank you all, but especially thank you, Manisha, for a wonderful talk, inspiring us all.
Thank you.
And I hope you enjoy the remainder of the conference.